In 1978, a university student named Stephen Kubacki went cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan and disappeared. 15 months later, he woke up in a field 700 miles away, wearing clothes that weren't his, with no memory of where he'd been. To this day, neither he nor investigators can explain what happened during those missing months. But his case points to something profound about being lost. It doesn't just disorient you physically. Search and rescue experts have documented specific psychological patterns that emerge when people realize they're not finding their way back. These mental shifts are so predictable that researchers can now map exactly when and how your mind will begin working against your survival. And some of these changes are so counterintuitive. They've cost people their lives even when rescue was just yards away. Most people assume being lost means you don't know where you are. That's only the beginning. The real crisis starts in your brain hours after you realize you're not finding your way back. And what unfolds follows patterns researchers have observed across thousands of cases worldwide. It's not random panic. It's a systematic breakdown of cognitive abilities that happens to experienced hikers and novices alike. Search and rescue teams encounter something strange when they find people who've been lost for more than a day or two. These individuals often walked right past obvious roads, trails, or campsites without recognizing them. One hiker was discovered less than 200 yards from a major highway after 3 days in the Smoky Mountains. He had crossed that highway twice but couldn't remember seeing it. According to survival psychology research, this represents your brain's fundamental processing systems beginning to fail under sustained stress. The psychological transformation begins within hours. Lawrence Gonzalez, who researched survival psychology for his book Deep Survival, describes what happens physiologically when you realize you're lost. Your hypothalamus triggers your fight-or-flight response, releasing stress hormones including cortisol and adrenaline. Gonzalez notes that cortisol interferes with the working of the prefrontal cortex, where perceptions are processed and decisions are made. Your visual field actually narrows. You see less, hear less, miss more environmental cues, and make mistakes. This hyper-alert state seems like it might sharpen your senses for threats, but it does the opposite. Your stressed brain starts creating patterns where none exist. Under this level of stress, people begin seeing trails that don't exist, convince themselves certain landmarks are familiar when they've never encountered them before, and create entirely fictional mental maps of their surroundings. The brain is so desperate for familiarity that it manufactures false order from chaos. Here's where lost person behavior becomes truly fascinating. Robert Koester created the International Search and Rescue Incident Database, which now contains data from over 150,000 search and rescue incidents worldwide. His research, published in the book Lost Person Behavior, identifies over 40 different categories of lost persons based on activity and demographics. Each category displays distinct behavioral patterns that search teams can use to predict where people are likely to be found. One of the most documented and counterintuitive behaviors is hiding, particularly common in children but also observed in adults under extreme stress. Children aged 1 to 6 who become lost frequently crawl into dense brush or under logs and remain silent even when searchers call their names. They're not being defiant. Kenneth Hill, a search and rescue psychologist who studied lost person behavior, found that under severe psychological stress, people stop trying to be found and start hiding instead. This makes no logical sense, but it reflects an ancient survival mechanism. When your amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes overwhelmed, it can trigger a freeze response. When you can't fight and you can't flee effectively, you hide. Even when hiding is the exact opposite of what will save you. Adult hikers have been found curled in the fetal position in small spaces, unable to explain afterward why they concealed themselves when rescue teams were actively searching nearby. What happens to your sense of time during extended periods of being lost creates additional problems for survival. Under extreme stress, your internal clock becomes unreliable. People lost for 3 days often believe only hours have passed. Others experience time dilation where one afternoon feels like a week. This occurs because your brain's time processing relies on creating distinct sequential memories, but when you're lost, every moment feels identical. You're walking through similar terrain, experiencing the same mounting anxiety. Your brain cannot create distinct timestamps for these repetitive experiences, so your sense of time collapses. This temporal disorientation has life-threatening consequences. Research shows that lost people regularly exhaust themselves walking in circles for what they thought was 20 minutes, but was actually 6 hours. Without an accurate sense of time, You cannot make rational decisions about conserving energy or rationing supplies. Around 24 to 48 hours after becoming lost, another psychological phenomenon emerges. You become so convinced you know where you are that you reject contradicting evidence. The sun is clearly setting in the west, but you convince yourself it's setting in the north, because your mental map requires it to be north. You find a stream flowing downhill toward civilization, but you walk upstream because your confused brain has decided that's the correct direction. Survivors interviewed after rescue often describe moments where they knew with absolute certainty which direction to go, despite having no logical reason for that knowledge. Almost all of them were wrong. Their brains had created false confidence to combat the unbearable psychological weight of uncertainty. This is your mind choosing comforting certainty over uncomfortable reality. After approximately 3 days without adequate water and under sustained psychological stress, cognitive function deteriorates further. Medical research on dehydration shows it can produce hallucinations. A 42-year-old woman with no psychiatric history was brought to an emergency department after being found wandering streets disoriented, experiencing command auditory hallucinations. She was diagnosed with severe dehydration. Upon treatment with fluids, her hallucinations completely resolved within days without psychiatric medication. The resolution of symptoms following rehydration alone provided strong evidence that dehydration was the sole cause. But interestingly, the hallucinations reported by lost people aren't random visions. Survivors consistently report seeing other humans who aren't there, often described with remarkable detail. An alpinist climbing Mount Hunter after 30 hours without sleep saw the rocks change shape into talons reaching toward him. He began calling his climbing partner by the wrong name, confusing him with someone from a previous climb. One study of climbers above 24,600 feet found that 32% reported hallucinations. Why do stressed, exhausted, dehydrated brains create people rather than other hallucinations? Because humans are fundamentally social creatures. Throughout evolutionary history, isolation from the group meant death. Research on high-altitude climbers shows these hallucinations often take the form of a third-person phenomenon involving what's called a felt presence or visual hallucinations of another person nearby. These presences are commonly identified as an acquaintance or family member. Sometimes these hallucinations help people make it through difficult moments by providing a sense of companionship. Sometimes they give dangerous advice or cause confusion that leads people further astray. There's another behavior pattern specific to hypothermia deaths called terminal burrowing and paradoxical undressing. A 1995 German study published in the International Journal of Legal Medicine examined 69 cases of death from hypothermia. They found that in about 25% of cases, victims in the final stages of hypothermia removed their clothing, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. This happens because as hypothermia progresses, the muscles controlling blood vessel constriction become exhausted and fail, causing warm blood to rush to the extremities. The dying person, already confused, suddenly feels burning hot and removes their clothes. Nearly all victims who exhibited paradoxical undressing also displayed terminal burrowing behavior. They crawled into small, enclosed spaces under beds, behind wardrobes, into shelves, or dense bushes before dying. The researchers concluded this is an autonomous process of the brainstem triggered in the final state of hypothermia that produces a primitive burrowing-like behavior similar to what's seen in hibernating animals. This isn't general lost person behavior, but demonstrates how the brain in extremis can trigger ancient survival mechanisms that no longer serve us in modern contexts. What's remarkable about most psychological effects of being lost is that they're largely reversible. People who've survived extended periods lost in wilderness show that within 6 months, stress hormone responses normalize, spatial processing returns to baseline, and temporal perception recalibrates. The human brain demonstrates remarkable neuroplasticity in recovering from these traumas. However, one change often persists: altered risk perception. People who've experienced being seriously lost tend to develop either extreme caution about any navigation situation or, paradoxically, become more reckless. Some survivors never venture into wilderness again. Others become obsessed with survival skills and wilderness experiences, repeatedly placing themselves in challenging situations as if attempting to master and overcome their trauma. Ghoster's database has revealed crucial insights about how lost people are found. According to research analyzing Yosemite National Park data, lost hikers were found an average of 3.34 kilometers from their last known position. One study analyzing general search and rescue statistics found that the average lost individual was found 1.8 kilometers from their starting point and only 58 meters from the nearest trail or road. It obviously doesn't take much for a hiker to become disoriented in wilderness. Understanding these behavioral patterns allows search teams to predict where different categories of lost persons are likely to be found. Children behave differently than adult hikers. People with dementia have different movement patterns than hunters. Coaster's work has given search and rescue teams probability maps showing where to concentrate their efforts based on who is lost. For hikers specifically, research shows they tend to be guided by terrain to linear features like streams, and they tend to move downhill. Linear features like streams account for the largest percentage of hiker-find locations. What all this research reveals is that being lost isn't just a physical navigation problem solvable with GPS technology. It's a profound psychological crisis that systematically attacks how your brain constructs reality. Your sense of time dissolves, your spatial reasoning fails, your survival instincts can reverse, your brain creates false certainties and phantom companions. And in extreme cases involving hypothermia, your most primitive neural systems can activate behaviors that once protected hibernating mammals but now lead you to hide in places where you won't be found. The documented patterns are so consistent that survival experts emphasize one critical principle. The moment you suspect you might be lost, stop immediately. Don't continue walking while hoping you'll recognize something. That first moment of uncertainty is when your cognitive abilities are still intact and you can make rational decisions. Sit down. Force yourself to think logically before the stress cascade begins. The most common mistake lost hikers make is continuing to push forward in the direction they were going, hoping they'll see something they recognize just around the next corner. That rarely happens. The most effective strategy, though least used, is backtracking until you know where you are. Once your brain fully realizes it's lost and the stress response kicks in, you're not just navigating unfamiliar terrain anymore. You're fighting against your own mind's desperate, often counterproductive attempts to cope with something it was never designed to handle. Your narrowed visual field will cause you to miss obvious landmarks. Your false pattern recognition will convince you of trails that don't exist. Your temporal disorientation will exhaust you without you realizing how long you've been walking. Your brain may create hallucinated companions or convince you to hide from the very people trying to save you. And in that fight between you and your ancient survival mechanisms, the wilderness isn't your biggest enemy. The misfiring circuits in your own skull are.